There is a single fruit that human beings have carried to the happiest day of a life, and to the very last one. Brides have thrown it against a wall to bless a marriage. Mourners have laid it inside tombs, beside the dead. It was carved into the house of a god and packed into barrels for an army freezing north of the Alps. Doctors ground it into medicine, and in the end, its name was handed to a weapon. Every one of those is the same thing. A fruit, not a rare one. You have probably got one sitting in a bowl in your kitchen right now. Red, heavy, a little strange, wearing a hard little crown on top, as if it knows something you don't. Cut it open, and you understand why it unsettled people. The outside is a shell, dry, tough, dead as old leather. But inside are hundreds of seeds, packed tight, glistening, wet, alive. And when the knife goes through them, the juice runs out red and pools on the board like blood. To some people, that was the purest picture of life they had ever seen. One fruit holding 100 lives inside it. To others, it was death, the food of the underworld, a thing you buried with the dead. The same fruit, two opposite ideas, held inside the same red shell for 4,000 years. So how did an ordinary piece of fruit come to mean everything at once? Birth and burial, marriage and the grave, medicine and war, to almost every people that ever found it. To answer that, we have to go back, before the supermarket, before Rome, before the pharaohs, to the dry hills where humans first stopped wandering and started to plant. Because this is not really a story about a fruit. It is a story about what people need a thing to be, and how one small fruit somehow became all of it. Let's begin where it began. The fruit before empires. Picture a dry hillside, somewhere between the mountains of Iran and Afghanistan, where the wild pomegranate is thought to have first grown. A wild tree grows there, twisted, thorny, tough enough to survive scorching summers and hard, freezing winters. And hanging from it, heavy and red, is a fruit no one planted. For a very long time, that is all the pomegranate was. Something you found, something wild. Then a person did something that changed everything. Imagine the first person who ever planted one. Perhaps a woman who has eaten the wild fruit her whole life and knows exactly where the good trees grow. One autumn, she does not eat all the seeds. She saves a handful, carries them home, and presses them into the soil beside her house. We will never know her name. She is not a person history recorded. She stands in for a slow, quiet thing that happened many times, over many lifetimes. But the choice is real. Somewhere, someone made it. Because a wild fruit belongs to the land. A planted fruit belongs to you. And the pomegranate turned out to be one of the earliest fruit trees humans ever chose to grow. Alongside the olive, the grape, the fig, and the date, it belongs to a tiny founding club, the original orchard, the handful of crops that helped turn people who gathered food into people who grew it. And the tree they planted was built to last. A pomegranate can keep giving fruit for well over 100 years. An old, gnarled tree, still heavy with red fruit, long after the person who planted it is dust. You can even hear that old journey in its name. The Romans called it the seeded apple, Pomegranatum, which is where our word pomegranate comes from. They also called it the apple of Carthage, after the great trading city across the sea, because they thought that was where it came from. They were wrong about the where, but they were right that this fruit was already moving. The fruit that could travel off the southern coast of Turkey, divers found a shipwreck. Not a modern one. A merchant ship that sank more than 3,000 years ago, in the Bronze Age, its hull packed with the wealth of the ancient world. Tons of copper, tin, glass, ivory, gold, and among the cargo, tucked into storage jars, the remains of pomegranates. Think about what that means. This fruit was no longer just growing in someone's garden. It was on a ship, worth loading into the hold and carrying across the sea, next to metal and treasure. And there was a very good reason. Almost all fruit is a nightmare to move. It bruises, splits, and rots before it arrives. In a world with no fridges and no fast roads, most fruit had to be eaten where it grew. But the pomegranate had that shell. The tough, leathery skin that makes it look so dead from the outside is really armor, protecting the soft seeds through rough handling and long roads. A pomegranate could ride in a basket on a donkey for days, over mountains and across deserts, and arrive whole. So it traveled. To picture how, imagine a trader leading a string of loaded animals along a dusty road. The valuable goods are strapped to the animals' backs. But tucked in among them is a basket of pomegranates, food that will not spoil before he gets home. When he stops for the night and shares one, a family tastes it, saves the seeds, and plants a tree of their own. That scene is imagined, but that is roughly how the fruit spread, not mainly by conquest. By seeds passed hand to hand, town to town, across 1,000 years. It became so prized that one city on the coast of what is now Turkey took its very name from the local word for pomegranate. The city was called Side, and for centuries it stamped the fruit onto its silver coins. The pomegranate had stopped being something wild you found on a hillside. It had become cargo, treasure, money, and one of the places it reached would fall for it harder than almost anywhere else, and would carry it, of all places, into the grave. The foreign fruit in the land of the dead. Here is something that surprises people. The pomegranate is not Egyptian. For all the times it turns up along the Nile, it did not grow there to begin with. It was a foreigner, brought in from the lands to the east, most likely during the age of the great warrior pharaohs, more than 3,000 years ago, and it arrived already famous. To the east, in the old cities of Mesopotamia, the pomegranate had long stood for fertility and plenty, and it reached Egypt, trailing that reputation. A special fruit, an exotic one. The Egyptians took it in, and to picture what it meant, imagine a gardener keeping a walled garden alive in a land of sand. Date palms, a still pool, and in the corner, a tree that came from far away, its branches heavy with red fruit. He reaches up, picks one, splits it open with his thumbs. The red inside catches the light. They did not just eat it, they fell for its shape, that round body, that little crown on top. It started turning up everywhere, worked into jewelry, painted onto walls, made into little vessels shaped like the fruit itself. And then there is the tomb. When archaeologists opened the burial of the boy king Tutankhamun, in among the gold was a small vessel of precious silver, shaped as a pomegranate, its surface worked with flowers. A dead king, buried with a silver copy of a fruit built for life. But it was not only silver copies. In other ancient Egyptian burials, archaeologists have found the real thing, actual pomegranates, dried hard by the centuries, placed in the dark beside the dead. Not carvings, not paintings. The fruit itself, laid down as an offering for the journey. Of all the foods they could have sent with a person into death, they chose this one, the one that looks dead on the outside and is impossibly alive within. Egyptian burial was built around a single idea, that life could continue on the far side of the grave. And here was a fruit that seemed to make the same argument all by itself. A hard, dead shell. And inside, packed in the dark, hundreds of living red seeds. You can see why they buried it with their dead. It looked like a promise. But the Egyptians were about to find there was far more to this fruit than its beauty. Some of it, they believed, could reach inside the living body itself. The ancient healers had a very specific, very grim problem. Worms, living inside people. Long, pale tapeworms coiled in the gut, quietly stealing food from the body that carried them. And one old weapon against them was this fruit. Imagine a child, somewhere in the ancient world, sick and thin, kept awake by a pain in the belly that will not go. Her mother brings her to a healer who grinds a bitter preparation from the bark and root of a pomegranate tree and has her drink it down, believing, as healers had for generations, that it can drive the thing out of her. Now, we have to be careful here. In a way the ancient world could not. What the record shows is that people used pomegranate this way for a very long time. Preparations from its bark and root against tapeworms stayed in serious medicine and pharmacies into more recent centuries, long after most ancient cures had been thrown out. And later chemistry did find that the plant contains compounds that can act on such worms. But being used for centuries does not, by itself, prove a treatment worked. Much of ancient medicine was tangled up with beliefs about the body that turned out to be completely wrong, and the people using it could not tell the difference. The honest way to say it is this: there may have been something real inside this old remedy, and a great deal of hope wrapped around it. The pomegranate became a whole shelf of such remedies. The juice, the rind, the flowers, the bark, the roots. People tried every part of it. Greek physicians, for one, pressed the sharp, drying rind onto wounds, believing it could pull torn flesh together and stop bleeding. Whether it healed the way they thought, we cannot say. But look at the picture in their minds. The fruit that looked like blood used to hold blood in, so picture it. An ancient healer grinding dried pomegranate skin in a stone bowl, and, thousands of years later, a modern scientist studying an extract of the very same fruit under a laboratory light. Different tools, different centuries, the same stubborn question. Can this fruit help us heal? We'll come back to that at the very end. But first, the fruit was about to turn up somewhere it had no business being. The fruit that followed the army, go north, cross the Alps, come down into the cold of what is now Switzerland, to an early Roman military settlement called Vindonissa. Grey skies, soldiers, a very long way from the warm coast where pomegranates grow. And there, in the ground, archaeologists found something that should not have been there. Inside charred wooden barrels, from the early days of Roman rule, the remains of pomegranates, enough that researchers believe the barrels had been used to store the fruit, a Mediterranean fruit, in storage. At a military base, north of the Alps. Now, we should be careful not to oversell this. It does not prove ordinary soldiers were handed pomegranates with their daily bread. What it shows is quieter, and in some ways stranger. This warm country luxury had reached the cold frontier of the empire at all. So picture a grey morning at the edge of the Roman world. Someone prizes the lid off a barrel that has come up from the south, and inside is fruit that has no business being this far north. Imagine one of them picking a pomegranate up. Maybe he grew up with this fruit, in a warm country he may never see again. For a moment, in the cold, he is somewhere else. That scene is imagined, the barrels are not, and getting that fruit there took real effort. Grown in the warm south, packed, carried over mountains to a fort in the fog. Because Rome did not just conquer territory. Wherever the legions went, they dragged an entire way of eating with them. Wine, olive oil, nuts, and fruit like this. The soldiers did not only carry swords across Europe, they carried the Mediterranean itself. And those charred barrels are the proof, still in the soil 2,000 years later. So the pomegranate was food and medicine and a taste of home at the empire's edge. But none of that is quite why we still tell stories about it. The real reason is what people decided it meant. Life. Look inside the fruit again. One shell, hundreds of seeds. A single object crammed almost impossibly full with the promise of more. To ancient eyes, that was not subtle. A fruit overflowing with seed was a fruit about fertility, about children, about the land coming back to life, year after year. And that one idea, many seeds, much life, sank deep into religion. When the Hebrew Bible describes the great Temple of Solomon, it pauses to describe the decoration. 2 huge bronze pillars stood at the entrance, and around the top of each ran rows of bronze pomegranates. Hundreds of them, built into the house of God. The fruit hung from the robe of the high priest, too. The hem of his robe was fringed with golden bells and woven pomegranates, one after another, so that the holiest man in the nation walked wrapped in the image of this fruit. Sit with why. Of every plant they could have carved into the holiest place they had, they chose the one that spills over with seed. The fruit was the message: life, abundance, more. And that same message turned into ritual, in culture after culture, Not because each simply happened to know the fruit, but because each looked at those crowded seeds and saw the same thing. Picture a bride on her wedding day. Her family smashes a pomegranate on the threshold as she arrives, and the seeds burst out across the stone. Everyone watching knows what it means. A wish, spoken in fruit, for a long life and a house full of children. She is holding the oldest blessing there is. The same picture kept surfacing. In Greece, people still smash one on the doorstep at New Year, the scattering seeds a wish for plenty in the year to come. Christianity looked at a fruit that splits its hard shell to pour out new life and saw a sign of resurrection, of rising from the tomb, and Renaissance painters placed it in the hands of the infant Christ. Carried east, its crowded seeds became a blessing for a house full of sons. Every time, the logic is the same. Many seeds, more life, and then one people took that exact same fruit, those exact same seeds, and turned them into the opposite of life. Death. There is a story the Greeks told to explain the seasons. Persephone is the daughter of the goddess of the harvest, of everything that grows. One day, she is dragged down into the underworld by Hades, the lord of the dead. Above ground, her mother's grief is so total that the whole earth goes cold and barren. Nothing grows, nothing lives. The first winter falls over the world, so at last a bargain is struck to bring the daughter back up to the light. But there is a rule in the land of the dead. Anyone who eats its food belongs to it. And Persephone, down there in the dark, has already eaten something. Pomegranate seeds, just a handful, and that is enough. Having tasted the food of the dead, she can never fully leave, so she is caught forever between two worlds. Part of the year she lives above, in the light, and her mother rejoices, and the earth blooms and gives fruit. And part of the year she must go back down, below, into the kingdom of the dead. And while she is gone, her mother mourns, and the world goes cold and bare again. That, the Greeks said, is why we have winter. Every year, the same daughter lost and found. Every year, the same seeds pulling her back down. Now look at what the fruit is doing in that story. The very same seeds that meant fertility and children, the seeds smashed on a wedding threshold to bless a marriage, are now the thing that chains a goddess to the grave. That is the heart of it, the whole mystery in a single image. There is nothing different about the seeds. The fruit did not change. Only what people needed it to mean changed. A wedding threshold, and the mouth of the underworld, and the exact same handful of red seeds does both. The Greeks were not even the only ones to feel it. Remember those Egyptian tombs, the real, dried fruit laid beside the dead. The living did not think the dead would eat it. That was never the point. The fruit was a message left in the dark, that life goes on, that the bond between the living and the dead is not fully broken by the grave. One people made it a blessing for a marriage, another laid it in a tomb. It was the same fruit, doing both, and it was about to be lifted onto the tip of a spear. The fruit on the spear turned east again, to the Persian world, where this fruit grew roots as deep as anywhere on earth. Here it was no stranger. It wound itself into food, into poetry, into the idea of a good life. In the old Persian faith, it was a sign of life that never ends. And on the longest, darkest night of the year, Persian families have long gathered to eat it. The red fruit, a small charm of light, held up against the dark. There it stood for life, plainly and simply, which is what makes the strangest Persian image so striking. Because in Persia, this fruit of life was also lifted onto the weapons of an empire's finest killers. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing about the armies of Persia, describes the king's most elite guard. And at the base of their spears, he says, instead of a plain iron spike, they carried pomegranates. The very best of them carried pomegranates worked in gold, the rest in silver. Picture that, a vast army on the march, a forest of spears, and on the end of each one, catching the sun, a small metal pomegranate. Gold for the elite, silver for the rest. You could read a man's rank by the fruit on his spear. A fruit lifted clean out of the orchard, and turned into the badge of the men who guarded a king. It is the same move, again and again, an offering to the dead, a myth of the seasons, a sign of God's abundance. Gold on the tip of a spear. Human beings never quite leave this fruit alone as just something to eat. But for most people, most of the time, that is exactly what it was. Food. And food had one great enemy. The fruit that beat the winter. Every family in the ancient world lived at the mercy of the seasons. The fruit ripens. For a few short weeks it is everywhere, and then it is gone, the tree bare, and the long, hungry winter coming. So the real question was never only how to eat the pomegranate, it was how to keep it. And this fruit had an answer. Picture a cook beside a fire, with a pot of pomegranate juice. Bright, sour, sweet. She lets it boil for hours, until the water cooks away, and what is left is thick and dark and glossy. A syrup. Fruit becomes juice. Juice becomes syrup. Syrup goes into a sealed jar. And a fruit that lived for a few weeks in autumn can now sit on a shelf for months. That same syrup is still made today. In the Middle East, they call it pomegranate molasses. Let the juice ferment instead, and it becomes wine, so old that ancient love poetry already sighs about drinking it. Now picture a family in the deep of winter, months after the last fruit fell. The tree outside is bare and black, but in the cool dark of the house sits that sealed jar. A single spoonful of dark syrup stirred into a pot of plain grain, and the whole meal changes. In a grey season that once meant hunger, there is suddenly a taste of the autumn that is gone. Kings had their golden pomegranates. Priests had their sacred ones, but so did the poor family with a jar of sour syrup, banking a little color against the cold. For thousands of years, the fruit had moved east and stayed east. Now it was about to travel the other way, west, into new empires and onto the shields of kings. The royal fruit. As a great new civilization rose across the Middle East and North Africa, the pomegranate rose with it, filling walled gardens where poets praised its jewel-like seeds. And carried west along that expanding world, it reached the far edge of Europe, Spain. There, one city loved the fruit so much it took the fruit's name for its own. The city was Granada, and the pomegranate became its emblem, so completely that to this day, a single red pomegranate sits at the foot of the national coat of arms of Spain. One fruit on a nation's shield, and that badge began to travel with the powerful. When a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon sailed to England to marry into its royal family, she carried the pomegranate of Granada with her as her personal badge. And so, for a strange few years, it stood beside the rose of the Tudors in the symbols of England, the emblem of a foreign queen. Until her marriage collapsed and helped tear a continent's faith in two. As the marriage fell, so did her fruit. The pomegranates were quietly taken down. A fruit could be a queen's badge one year, and an embarrassment scraped off the wall the next. From Spain, the fruit boarded ships again, this time across an entire ocean. Carried to the Americas, it was planted in the gardens and missions of the West, and found a second home in the warm valleys of California, one of the great pomegranate-growing regions of the world today. But the strangest journey the fruit ever made was not across any ocean. It was into the language of war. The fruit on the spear, again. When early gunpowder weapons appeared, small iron balls, packed with powder, that burst and scattered their fragments, soldiers reached for a word. They looked at that round, hard-shelled body, full of packed grains waiting to burst, and thought of one thing: the pomegranate. In the old languages, the fruit's name was a version of Granada, grenade, and it was handed straight to the weapon. That is where our word grenade comes from. It simply means pomegranate. A fruit that had stood for 4,000 years, for fertility, for children, for the paradise garden, for life that never ends, gave its name to a small object built to kill. Life and death, one more time, inside the same round, red shape. And then, in our own time, the fruit did something new. It became a health headline. The fruit comes back. In the last few decades, a fruit that people had loved and used for 4,000 years was suddenly discovered all over again and sold back to us as if we had never seen it, bottled as juice, marketed hard as a superfood, pushed onto shelves and into cocktail bars in countries where it does not even grow. And here, we have to be as careful as the ancient healers could not be, because there are really 4 different things, easy to blur into one. There is what people traditionally did, using the fruit for all sorts of ailments, for thousands of years. There is laboratory research, modern scientists finding the juice unusually rich in certain bitter, dark compounds, and testing what those compounds do in a dish. There is clinical evidence, the much harder question of whether drinking the juice makes a real difference to a real person's health, where most of the big, dramatic claims remain unsettled. And there is marketing, the bottle that quietly lets you believe all of that has already been proven. The honest position is the modest one. Scientists are genuinely interested. Some findings are promising. But interest is not proof, and it would be wrong to say modern science has proven the ancients right. The old healers were not running trials. They were hoping, guessing, and sometimes, maybe, stumbling onto something real. We are still finding out which. Once again, we have picked this fruit up and decided it means something we need. 4,000 years ago, it promised life after death. Today, it promises a longer, healthier life. Different century, same hope, poured into the same red shell. Which brings us all the way back to your kitchen. Your kitchen. So go back to that bowl on your counter. Pick the fruit up. Feel the weight of it. That hard shell, that little crown. Only now you know what you are holding. You are holding the fruit that a Bronze Age merchant loaded onto a ship beside his copper and gold. That the Egyptians laid in a boy king's tomb, in silver and in dried and withered life. That a healer ground into a bitter medicine, hoping to save a child. That reached a Roman fort in the cold fog north of the Alps. You are holding the seeds that chained a goddess to the underworld, and the fruit that hung in bronze in the house of God. The blessings smashed on a wedding threshold, the gold on a soldier's spear, the badge of a queen, and the name of a weapon. And here is the quiet miracle of it. Not that kings prized it, or that gods were offered it, though both are true, but that an ordinary family, with no gold, no temple, no army, could hold the very same fruit and take from it the very same things. Beauty, flavor, a medicine to hope in, a little insurance against the winter, and a blessing to hand down to their children. Its real power was never that it survived for thousands of years. Plenty of things survive. Its power is that human beings kept finding new reasons to keep it. When one meaning wore out, another was waiting. Kitchen to tomb, tomb to myth, myth to spear, and back again. It never once let go. So cut it open, tonight, in your own kitchen. The shell resists, then it gives. The seeds spill out, red and wet and alive. The juice runs like blood. And maybe that is the real answer to the mystery we started with. Why one fruit could belong equally to the wedding and the tomb, to the cradle and the grave. Because every single time human beings broke open its hard shell, they found the very same contradiction waiting inside. The color of blood, filled with the seeds of life.